our black women today. 100 years of pain, suffrage, and sorrow. Yesterday, today, and tomorrow. It's time to honor those erased from her story. It's time to rise and take our place. In this moment we won't be erased. Time to rise, time to rise. Stand in our power today.
Welcome to our Kitchen Table Talks, a podcast of the Public Engagement Initiative, Unerased, Black Women Stories. I'm Gwen McKinney, creator of Unerased. This trilogy of episodes explores women owning our bodies, especially the reproductive force of our individual and collective selves, of our mothers and their mothers, and our girl children yet unborn. We take a sober and supportive look at Black women through the sacred temple that is our body and soul. The theme at this table: reproductive justice, the past, possibilities, and enlightened policies.
About 50 years ago, a group of pioneering Black women came together because they recognized that the conversations around reproductive choice and rights and freedom did not fully speak to our experience as Black women.
So I think the way that we can address menstrual hygiene is to understand it's under the umbrella of menstrual health. So we have to we have to address it in a comprehensive manner and realize that giving the products is one thing, but also resources, education, support, advocacy, and all those also add to it so that people can live in dignity. So if we don't have access to the basics of needs and education, then we can't address our mind, bodies, or spirits because we have deficits in all of those areas.
I'm an ordained Christian minister who believes that women, all women, have the spiritual right and should have the legal right to make decisions about their own bodies.
There's this 400-year history of abuse of Black women, and there was a need to address reproductive issues in a fuller, more holistic way. As Black women have, I think, suffered longest and the most, we can start there. Anything that would lift up the health of Black women would improve outcomes for all women.
Economics as a whole is a social construct that basically keeps certain populations from reaching their full potential. And that is heavily embedded in laws and policies affecting menstruating individuals. The cost really prohibits them from living in dignity, reaching their full potential, and just doing what they need to succeed.
I really focus on the individuals, not on some slate of requirements and rights and wrongs and do's and don'ts, not on some such slate. And I grew up in that kind of context. And I saw the incredible adverse impact that slate had in so many, many people's lives.
You cannot care for my body if you see me as somehow less than fully human. If you are not willing to accord me the dignity and respect of listening to me describe my condition, of letting me explain my concerns or fears or problems.
Mind, Body, Spirit Incorporated. That is a comprehensive sexuality awareness organization. It basically decreases the stigmas and silence around the wellness of the body as a whole and doesn't look at it as only an external device for other people, but the internal part of people really having ownership and autonomy of their body. One of the main things that we integrate when we're talking about reproductive justice is that our bodies are our own.
No one else has the right to come in as vigilante and say, no, here's what you're supposed to do based on their contexts and their own theological understandings and nobody has that right. Not a religious leader and surely not a legislator. I'm Reverend Dr. Carrie Jackson. I am the Director of Spiritual Care and Activism at Religious Coalition for Reproductive Choice.
My name is Lynette Metley. I'm the founder and CEO of No More Secrets Mind, Body, Spirit Incorporated and the co-founder of the Spot Period Hub, the nation's first and only menstrual hub and wellness center.
I'm Linda Jackson Leslie. I am the Senior Communications Specialist for the National Partnership for Women and Families.
Welcome to Unerased. I am your host, Carolyn Malachi, and I'm here with Dr. Dorothy Roberts. Dr. Roberts, we are honored to welcome you to our Unerased table. The importance and relevance of your voice dictated that we depart from our normal format of a three-way conversation and just talk to you one-on-one. So welcome.
Thank you. I'm very honored to be on your podcast.
Glad to have you. So our episode subject is reproductive justice, the past, possibilities, and enlightened policies. Your seminal work, Killing the Black Body, actually provided the framework for the reproductive justice movement. It may be obvious to some folks, but can you share the connection of the title, Killing the Black Body, to this very important topic?
Killing the Black Body was my attempt to explain the history of Black women's childbearing and ways in which the U.S. government and private actors had tried to constrain it from the time of slavery until the present time. I wrote the book in the late 1980s and it was published in 1997, so up till that period. And I wanted to point out that reproductive history in the United States really revolved around the attempted regulation of Black women's bodies. And so I called it Killing the Black Body because these policies that existed since the time of slavery were a way of devaluing Black life. They were a way of subjugating Black people by, at first, forcing Black women to have children that were considered the property of their enslavers. But then after emancipation, a whole slew of policies over the next century that, and more, that devalued Black women's childbearing, that attempted to limit the fertility of Black women. And so killing, in a way, was a metaphor for these very violent policies and practices that try to control Black women's bodies and that disparaged Black women in these deep ways. And also were attempting to limit the numbers of Black people. And so killing was a metaphor for this violence. But in some cases, Black women have actually been killed as a result of these policies. But I mostly meant it as a metaphor for the way in which our bodies have been controlled and regulated and devalued over the course of U.S. history.
Your exposition carries us through the historical maze of bondage and oppression, from the enslaved woman forced to be both the producer and reproducer to the welfare queen, depicted as a drain on our society. What are the parallels and maybe deviations of those two caricatures? In other words, how similar or dissimilar are they?
What they have in common is the idea that Black women should not control their own bodies, that Black women need to be supervised in order to be safe for society. They are caricatures, images of Black women as having reproductive bodies that need to be controlled, either in order to produce children that were considered the property of enslavers, or to not have children who were considered to be destined to become criminals and welfare dependents because their mothers were portrayed as these deviant types of women who had babies just to get a welfare check and didn't actually care for their children. So they have in common this both negative, disparaging view and portrayal of Black mothers, but also a view that leads to the need for supervision. This is really critical in the way in which Black women have been treated. So that's what they have in common. Now, they're different because the way in which the white power elite viewed Black children was very different in the slavery era and the post-slavery era. So during the slavery era, under law, Black children could be owned as property by white enslavers. And of course, this was very valuable property to them. These were the children who were going to become workers, the labor for white enslavers. And so in that case, it was profitable to encourage Black women to have children who were deemed chattel property. Now, I want to emphasize that, of course, children are human beings and cannot actually be owned by another human being. And so at that time, the profit motive of enslavers was to encourage more reproduction by Black women, again, under the control of white domination. By the time we get to the welfare queen, the so-called welfare queen, an idea that started under the Reagan administration and continued to be popular. Well, I think it continues to be popular today, but it was extremely popular during the 1980s and 1990s, so much so that it helped to fuel the end of the guarantee, the federal guarantee to welfare benefits to help needy families take care of their children. So under the Clinton administration, at that point, and in between, at the end of formal enslavement of Black people to the time of the restructuring of welfare, there were a number of policies that were directed at keeping Black women from having so many children based on this myth that Black women's childbearing is dangerous and needs to be supervised and monitored and reduced. And so when we get to the welfare queen image, it's now an era where Black children are seen as surplus, as unnecessary, as disposable, because they're no longer legally owned by white people. But again, I think we have to see them as a whole, as an integrated series of policies that are all based on this fundamental idea, a white supremacist idea, racist idea, that Black women's childbearing needs to be controlled, whether it's to produce more children to benefit white people or whether it's to not have children to benefit white people. But this idea that Black women's childbearing is not, our own, that we shouldn't have control over our own bodies, that our childbearing, our bodies are suitable for social policy. I think it's important to see this unity of these damaging portrayals and policies, even though they may appear to be even opposite of each other.
It's not too far-fetched or too difficult to think about what you just said, and then within that framework, I think about fibroids and other reproductive issues that Black women tend to have, and wonder if this is strategic. I mean, not to put on my tinfoil hat, as some would say, but it's not. I mean, it just makes you wonder.
You should wonder. It's not a tinfoil hat. We could see a consistent pattern of policies over the course of U.S. history, and a consistent pattern of outcomes for Black women that are at our disadvantage. Think about the politics that produce these outcomes. One important part of the white supremacist ideology about Black women and our bodies and our childbearing capacity is that Black women's wombs produce the bad outcomes for their children and their communities. This is a way of blaming Black women for what is actually the product of racism, structural racism and white supremacy. And this also is a critical aspect of these policies that we can see ties together a number of policies and practices over the course of U.S. history. And this ties into what you were mentioning about fibroids and the way in which healthcare, the whole healthcare system, has subordinated Black women, mistreated Black women. It is a result of structural racism in living conditions, but also in healthcare, that results in Black women having various poor health outcomes, especially related to our reproductive bodies and lives. Now, that's not a coincidence, because it's all tied together. It's tied together in terms of policies and practices that disparage us, that mistreat us, but also it's tied together in the very ideology of blaming Black women's childbearing for the disadvantages that are caused by racism. And so by blaming us and inventing this idea that our bodies naturally produce bad outcomes, it also becomes an excuse for the health disparities that are caused by structural racism. All of this is tied together. The racism in the healthcare profession, as well as in reproductive health policy, as well as in the failure to address structural racism, and instead of blaming Black women for those bad outcomes, they all are tied together. There's so much about white supremacy and racist practices in the U.S. that center on Black women's bodies. I think you can't really understand how white supremacy operates, how structural racism operates, without thinking about the way in which Black women's bodies have been at the center of these really devastating ideologies and practices, diverting attention away from the radical social change that needs to happen. So, I hope I've been able to capture, it's complex in a way, because there's so many tentacles and configurations of these really damaging and dehumanizing policies and practices and ways of thinking, but they come down to this fundamental idea that Black women naturally produce harm through their childbearing.
You've written extensively about contraception, ranging from forced sterilizations to pharmaceutical substances like Norplant. So how has public policy, and you kind of spoke to this a few minutes ago, but how has public policy supported or abated their use on Black, Indigenous, and other marginalized women?
Well, one of the instruments of implementing the kinds of ideologies I've been talking about that devalue Black women's childbearing and devalue our control over our own bodies is sterilization. It's the ultimate tool of reproductive repression because it is a way of ending the ability of someone to have a child. And it's a very violent way of doing that. It's an invasion, a surgical invasion of someone's body, but it also terminates their ability to have children. And this has been a tool that has been used in the United States since the eugenics era. It was the favorite tool of eugenicists, and most states in the nation passed mandatory sterilization laws that allowed for forcible sterilization of people deemed unworthy of having children. Initially, it was mostly poor white women who were being sterilized, and men as well. And that policy turned toward Black women, especially Black women who received welfare benefits, as a way of keeping them from having more children who were seen as a burden on U.S. society. That has also taken other forms besides sterilization. It also has taken the form of pressuring women to use certain forms of birth control, especially what's called long-acting reversible contraceptives. So they're not sterilization in the sense that they are reversible, but the preferred kind for population control policy is the type of contraception that's hard to take out yourself. So contraceptives that are surgically implanted, like Norplant and IUDs, and also, or that are injected, like Depo-Provera, with the shot, you can't take the chemical out of your body. Norplant requires a minor surgical procedure to get it out, as does an IUD. And so these are short of sterilization. They really are forms of temporary sterilization that allow healthcare providers and the government to have considerable control over people who are forced to use them. Of course, all of these reproductive contraceptive methods are fine as long as they're truly voluntarily chosen by the person who's using them. But of course, it's very different to be forced to use them or to be encouraged to use them for unjust reasons. The first choice for so-called at-risk teenagers, which is sometimes code word for pressuring Black and Latinx teenagers to use these long-term contraceptives without giving them the option of other forms of contraception, based on the false idea that the reason why they're living in segregated, impoverished neighborhoods is because they have too many babies. That is not the reason why. And so once again, this idea that childbearing is the cause of social inequality is a false and dangerous idea, and it leads to policies that are coercive instead of policies that ensure that there is free, voluntary access to birth control.
And because there's not that free voluntary access, because we've seen these results, your thinking is that contraceptions encroach upon reproductive freedom instead of expanding it.
Well, they can do either one. They can expand it. I'm a big supporter of generous access to all forms of reproductive health services, including abortion, including contraception, including sterilization, if that's what you want. But I am adamantly opposed to using any of these forms of contraception as a force of population control, or based on the idea that the way to solve social problems is to get people to have fewer children. I'm also opposed to the idea that you should compel someone to have a child who doesn't want to have one. So there's to me, I think it's pretty easy to understand the difference between the two. I mean, one of the central tenets of reproductive justice is that this is not just a question of giving people a choice, because the society we live in has conditions, unequal conditions, that deny people the ability to have a choice. So just saying you have the choice to, say, terminate a pregnancy or to use a particular form of contraception does not, or to have a baby, means nothing if you don't have the money to afford any of it, or if you're living in a society that's going to punish you for your decision. It's not a free decision to say, I'll have a baby if you're going to be prosecuted for it. It's not a free decision to say, I'll terminate a pregnancy if you're going to be prosecuted for it or have some other punishment because of it.
Let's wrap our conversation on this idea of reproductive justice, reproductive liberty. What does that actually mean? And please share some of the essential requisite steps to achieving it.
Okay, so I do want to make very clear that at the same time that there has been this long history of attempted control over Black women's childbearing and violence against Black women, including sterilization, including incarceration, including disparaging stereotypes, all of that against Black women and punishing us for our childbearing decisions. Black women have always resisted from the very beginning these attempts to control our bodies. One of those more recent examples of it is the reproductive justice movement that was begun. The term was coined by a group of Black feminist activists at a conference where they got together and said, we need a different way of approaching reproductive freedom. And so this is a matter of life and death, as well as freedom and justice. Of course, those go hand in hand.
Dr. Dorothy Roberts, thank you so much.
Oh, you're so welcome.
Not a word about colored woman inside. But I have as much muscle as any man. I can work as much as any man. This is our moment to tell our story, how we offered our gifts without glory.
Thanks for listening to Kitchen Table Talks, made possible by support from Craig Newmark Philanthropies, the Park Foundation, TD Charitable Foundations, and anonymous donors. Our theme song, A Black Woman's Love Song, features LaTasha Brown on vocals and Glenn Pearson on piano. Special thanks to our advocacy partner, the White Dress Project, our coordinating producer, Bria Russ, and host audio producer, Carolyn Malachi. We had help from Levi Perrin, Alyssa Davis, and Alex Kavoris. I'm Gwen McKinney, creator of Unerased, inviting you to tune in to the next episode. And while you're there, please subscribe and visit us online at srpunerased.com.